Okay, we'll start the program. Now that we have nearly 70 people on board, we will start the program. Srinivas?
Yeah, okay, sir.
Yeah. Good evening, friends. Welcome to this particular session of continuing medical education programs of Andhra Medical College, Visakhapatnam. We have been conducting this program for the last over 1 year, and so far we have completed 83 of such programs, and this being the 84th. As you are all aware, that the whole process was initiated with the inputs from our district collector, past district collector, Shri Vinay Chen, who said that we have to empower all the doctors and the other healthcare professionals with the latest developments in the treatment of the COVID-19 management. And ever since we have been conducting these programs, and I'm very glad to say that people from India and those from United States of America have come forward, our friends, particularly the alumni of Andhra Medical College, and they have been participating in this very actively. To name a few, Dr. Sridhar Chilumuri of Bronx Lebanon Hospital, Dr. Khairam Ramohan Rao of Texas, and Dr. Prasad Chalasani, the president of MCANA. All these were contributing towards the development of our knowledge base. So, all these programs are aimed at dealing with this problem wherever we have at a particular stage of this particular disease. And when we have started, we initially went on to see what the symptoms and signs are like, and what is the clinical presentation. Later we went on to the diagnosis. After that we discussed certain clinical protocols. Later certain complications, post-COVID syndrome and long COVID syndrome, so on and so forth. And recently, last week, our beloved district collector, Dr. A. Mallikarjuna, has asked me to conduct one particular program on the differential diagnosis of the dengue fever in the wake of the COVID pandemic. Because there is a lot of confusion amongst the doctors themselves as to how the dengue presents and how the COVID-19 presents and how one has to differentiate between these two. And he felt that this message has to go to all the treating doctors of dengue in this particular district. So we have decided to have a special program. Normally, as you all are aware, we conduct this program on Sunday morning at 6:30 a.m., which will be 8 p.m. in the United States of America towards the eastern side. So now in between, during the week, we thought it would be appropriate to have this knowledge because of the urgency of the situation. Our district collector felt that we should be able to deal with this particular problem very effectively so that the number of deaths can be minimized. And as the number of cases of dengue are rising, so also the pandemic has not waned off. So it is time that we all should rise to the occasion, try to learn enough so that we can differentiate and treat the patients appropriately. So for this, I have selected three very eminent speakers for this program. One being the head of the Department of Medicine, Andhra Medical College, Visakhapatnam, Professor S. Srinivas. He's got a rich knowledge of not only the topic, but very extensively he has taught the students for many decades. So I thought that it would be appropriate for him to talk on the seasonal fevers which happen during the COVID pandemic and how to differentiate them and what is the real burden of these seasonal fevers during the COVID pandemic. He'll be talking to you about that, and he is going to tell us as to how they behave. He is going to give us an overview of what's happening. After him is Dr. Lakshmi Saujanya, another important resource person that we have in Andhra Medical College, who has been instrumental in training thousands of students as well as doctors during the early period of the pandemic. Not only with the donning and doffing and other measures, but also in discussing the treatment protocols very extensively. And I thought that she would be very appropriate to discuss the differences between the COVID and the dengue and how to differentiate them. She'll be speaking the core subject of what is there in the mind of our beloved collector. And after that, what is more important is to prevent. So the prevention and treatment have to go hand in hand. Prevention is as important as treating these individuals. So we have Professor of Community Medicine, Dr. Y. Padmasri, who again is a very knowledgeable as well as a very proactive worker in the COVID pandemic, and she is the one who handled the 104 call center, or the call center which was developed in the initial phases of the COVID pandemic. She has very effectively managed that, and she is highly knowledgeable with regards to the prevention. I told her to speak about the seasonal prevention of the seasonal fevers as well as the COVID, and each one of them will be taking around 15 minutes of their time. After which we will, at the end of the session, we will have the questions. So I request each one of you to put your question in the chat box, so that we can go through the chat box and direct the questions to the speakers, so that they will be answering towards the end. So let the presentations be complete in the initial 45 minutes, followed by our discussion. Please feel free to ask the questions, however silly they may appear initially, but that would be what is required. And I urge people to not to speak, not to unmute and speak when the session is going on, number one. Number two, you can put your video on but not the audio. The second aspect is, I request to name all your phones with your proper name, with your name. Otherwise, the device names and all are coming, so that we are not able to identify who are the people who have attended. I am sure that all the medical officers of the PHCs, CHCs, area hospitals and district hospitals are attending this, as well as those of our friends who are treating dengue fevers in the private sector are also attending this particular program, who are the main source of care, point of care at various places. So with these few words, I thank our district collector for giving not only the opportunity, but for the great thought he had to have this and to spread the knowledge of seasonal fevers during COVID pandemic, with particular reference to the dengue fever. Thank you. Over to Dr. Srinivas to start his presentation.
Good evening, sir. Thank you for the nice words and nice introduction, sir. I'd like to thank you very much, sir, for giving me this opportunity. So I'll be speaking on seasonal fevers during the COVID pandemic. I will not go into the depths of the COVID pandemic, but other fevers which we come across, because I've been seeing these medical wards for the past 1.5 to 2 decades. And during this rainy season, most of the cases, nearly 70 to 80% of the cases are fevers only. That's why I kept this our tropical country map, as well as the map here. That's the Visakhapatnam map. If you go by the definition, fever is an elevation in the body temperature that exceeds the normal daily variation and occurs in conjunction with an increased hypothalamic set point, that is from 37 degrees centigrade to 39 degrees centigrade. And it is said that whenever I teach the students, I say, of all the conditions we come across day in and day out, fever is a challenge to the physician. And the common fevers we come across during the rainy season in India, especially this particular season, are malaria, dengue, typhus, enteric fever, leptospirosis, chikungunya, H1N1, and acute diarrheal illness also. Most of these cases usually go to the communicable disease hospital. That's why most of us are not aware as the medical college is concerned, but in the outside areas, in the rural areas, this is one acute diarrheal illness that usually we come across. During my PHC days, I have seen overnight 78 cases. A school has been completely occupied by these cases only. And for the past 1.5 years, a new scourge of mankind, that's COVID-19, has emerged as a challenge to our mankind. I'll go as a case scenario. This is the first case. I'll come to it later on. And this is the second case. And the objective of this presentation is why should we know about these tropical fevers and what should be the approach, case scenarios and summary. Why you need to know about the tropical fevers? These are one of the most common cause of acute febrile illness. This is very, very important. People will be flocking around in the hospitals with this acute febrile illness, and sometimes they may be the reason for a pyrexia of unknown origin.
Srinivas, can you be a little loud?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Come closer to your microphone.
Okay, sir. The epidemiological pattern of the tropical infections is changing, and malaria is not the number one cause nowadays. And Sri Lanka, a couple of years back, has announced that it is devoid of malaria. But still, we do have malaria as one of the best presentations in India as fever is concerned. But now it is dengue rather than malaria, which is the number one we come across. And these fevers are difficult to differentiate from one another. And if unrecognized, we may lose the patient also. A slight responsibility on the part of the physician, we may lose the patient. And with simple approach, it is easy to diagnose and easy to manage also. The approach is more important. And if you come to the general principles, whenever the first approach, as soon as the patient comes to us in your OP or in the emergency department or in the non-ICU, that's in the hospital wards, we have to assess the Q-SOFA score. SOFA is nothing but a sequential organ failure assessment, Q-SOFA, a means of rapidly identifying OP or emergency department with suspected infection and patients who are at least risk of complications. At least two of these criteria should be fulfilled: a respiratory rate of more than 22 per minute, altered sensorium, and a systolic blood pressure of less than 100 milliliters of mercury. So if Q-SOFA is more than 2, score is more than, admit the patient or closely monitor in the OP. So any fever, the first thing we have to do is we go for the localized signs and symptoms. So that's why history and physical examinations are very, very important. So see for the localizing symptoms and signs, if they are present or not present. So if no localizing symptoms are present, say for example, if the patient with a localizing symptom like a neck stiffness, a Kernig's positive, then we can say probably this patient has meningitis, we can go in the right direction. But if no localizing signs are present, then we are in a dilemma. What is this fever? It can be typhoid, dengue, scrub typhus, malaria, leptospirosis. All these come under our differential diagnosis, and of course, COVID. But what are the localizing signs and symptoms we come across? So if the patient has dyspnea, cough, pleuritic pain, think of pneumonia. X-ray and sputum culture and sensitivity, this will do, and we can go in the right direction. A severe sore throat, nose block, and running nose. It's an upper respiratory infection, and this we have to think of COVID. Frequency of urination, dysuria, and loin pain, have to think of urinary tract infection. Headache and neck stiffness, meningitis, ear discharge, otitis, and diarrhea, abdominal pain, vomiting. And previously, this was known as gastroenteritis, but in fact, we have to use the term acute diarrheal illness because gastroenteritis is synonymous with cholera. And we remember cholera is a notifiable disease. And if at all, if we are able to culture the organism of cholera, we have to notify the higher authorities and the government also. And septic arthritis, osteomyelitis, and cellulitis also will come into localizing signs and symptoms. And now coming to the first scenario, a 40 years male, type 2 diabetic patient with history of 4 days fever. And he has chills and rigors. He has body pains and backache, headache and vomitings. He's apparently normal till 3 p.m. 4 days back. And he has no contact with a sick person. And he has a diffuse rash all over the body. So these are the differential diagnoses we have to come across: dengue, malaria, scrub typhus, typhoid, and leptospirosis. And this patient did not have any localizing symptoms. The vitals appear to be stable. So what are the common tropical fevers we come across? These should be considered first: dengue, typhoid, malaria, and leptospirosis. But common and considered less often, that's a scrub typhus, swine flu, other influenzas, tuberculosis, HIV, and viral hepatitis. Not so common, but not to be ignored. Histoplasmosis, brucellosis, and melioidosis. Uncommon, but not to forget. Leishmaniasis, amoebiasis, encephalitis, rabies. And the newer ones, of course, are Zika, Nipah, and the least latest one, the COVID. And what is the duration-based approach? So we have to take the history carefully. If it is a short duration of less than 1 week, we have to think in terms of this arbovirus. That's a dengue, chikungunya, and Zika. And here I want to tell you, this chikungunya is a Nigerian word, means doubling up, where the patient with a severe joint pains, he will be just crouching himself as if he was a fetus in the mother's womb. That's how the name is derived. Chikungunya is doubling up as a Nigerian word. And respiratory viruses like flu, H1N1, COVID-19, malaria, and Nipah virus, these are short duration the patient will present to us. If it's between 1 and 2 weeks, you have to think in terms of a typhoid fever, scrub typhus, leptospirosis, malaria, and hepatitis. And a longer duration that is more than 2 weeks, you have to think of these conditions like typhoid, typhus, brucellosis, histoplasmosis, malaria, and amoebiasis, and not the least tuberculosis also. So how to approach to a fever in the tropics? So you need not go for the advanced tests. So a simple thing is the first thing we have to do is history and physical examination. Second step is the basic investigations, and very rarely advanced tests are taken. The history taking is, if the patient has sudden onset fever, think of viral dengue, chikungunya, and H1N1. Consumption of a contaminated food, you have to think in terms of typhoid, viral hepatitis, and amoebiasis. Exposure to pets, leptospirosis, and melioidosis. Patient exploring bushy areas, parks, agriculture, and gardening, scrub typhus. Contact with the sick persons, you have to think of respiratory viruses, COVID, H1N1, tuberculosis, and varicella. And animal handling, drinking unpasteurized milk, you have to think of brucella, leptospirosis, and anthrax. So history taking is the first important thing we have to do. And here, if the patient is still containing fever, and if the patient is giving a history that he has taken the following drugs, if the patient has taken cephalosporins for more than 5 days, leptospirosis and typhoid are unlikely. So our approach should.
So you're not audible, Srinivas. Your microphone went off.
Just I'll go.
Yeah, now you're audible. Can you please repeat that?
Yes, sir. So previous antibiotics and drug history. Am I audible, sir? Am I audible, sir?
Perfect.
Perfect. Okay, thank you, sir. So if the patient has given a previous antibiotic or a drug history, and if the patient has taken a cephalosporin, if at all the patient brings along with him the drugs that he has used, think in terms of leptospirosis and typhoid, are unlikely. If doxycycline is taken for more days, scrub typhus is unlikely, because this is such a type of disease. Even though the mortality rate and morbidity rate is more and more with scrub typhus, if the patient has taken doxycycline for just more than 3 days, most of the patients are likely to become normal. And if the patient has taken azithromycin of more than days, typhoid, leptospirosis, and scrub typhus are unlikely. Antibiotics, fever subsided, but relapsing again. Think of tuberculosis, occult abscess, and endocarditis. Fever subsided with chloroquine, have to think of malaria, dengue, and autoimmune disorders. And if the patient is responding, that the fever is coming down with naproxen, think in terms of lymphomas. So lymphomas are one conditions where the patient's fever will settle with naproxen. So this is I've taken from the Davidson textbook of medicine only. You can see here, you have to examine the patient right from top to toe. Eyes, head and neck, oropharynx, neurological manifestations, head and lungs, and then abdomen. And if possible, you can go for a chest X-ray. And then see the nails and the hands, skin examination, musculoskeletal, genitalia, and the rectum. So from top to toe, you should not miss what exactly is happening to the patient. The physical examination, you can see if the patient has diffuse erythema or blanching rash, think of dengue, chikungunya, and Zika virus. So these are exanthematous fevers. Eschar, scrub typhus, and other rickettsial infections, and anthrax. Conjunctival congestion, think of leptospirosis and dengue. If the patient is paler, malaria and brucella are possibility, but most often it's malaria. And it is said that with every one attack of fever, that if the patient had fever right now and tomorrow evening at the same time, he will be losing about 2% of the RBC will be lost with each attack of fever. And you can imagine if the patient has been suffering for the past 3-4 days, 8% of the RBC are lost and the patient usually lands in pallor. And jaundice, we have to think of leptospirosis, scrub typhus, and viral hepatitis. And if the patient has hepatomegaly, we have to think of amoebiasis, typhoid, malaria, scrub typhus, and viral hepatitis. And if the patient has splenomegaly, think of these conditions like typhoid, once again, malaria, brucella, leptospirosis, and tuberculosis. And lymphadenopathy, we have to think of scrub typhus, tuberculosis, and histoplasma once again. And tropical fever, again, the same thing. Comorbid illness, we have for occupation, travel, contact with a sick person, food habits, water exposure to the pets, as well as exploration to the bushes, recent antibiotic use, allergy, similar in the community. Confirm the temperature first, general examination, look for localizing signs like rales, loin tenderness, neck stiffness, sinus tenderness, and look for examination. The patient may not show us, but we have to search carefully about an Eschar. The skin lesions like rash, purpura, and the glands, they have to lymphadenopathy, liver and the spleen, as well as joints and the eye examination should be done. And clinical diagnosis, probable typhoid, clinical leptospirosis, clinical subtyphoid, clinical dengue. But clinical diagnosis is not allowed and lab confirmation is needed. Suppose if you are clinically suspecting one case, if a lab confirmation is present, you are in the right direction. And in the yesteryears, that is about 10 years back, a decade back, we used to use the word clinical malaria, but suspect need to be improved. Clinical tuberculosis, say the spear, CVNAT, or minimum histopathology, exudate lymphocytes, CSF blood fuse should be present. And what is good clinical diagnostic practice? A guide to the clinicians in developing countries. Clinical malaria, just now I told you, is not a medical entity and has resulted in a great overdiagnosis of malaria and underdiagnosis of other causes of fever. So what we do is if the patient's QBC for MP or smear for MP is negative, we straight away go for chloroquine, but the fever will not subside. So we overdiagnose malaria, but we underdiagnose the other causes of fever. So treatment is based on clinical criteria without laboratory information. You should not go for it. And tests, we have to go for the complete blood count. We have to go for the liver function test. And we have to see if the patient has a decrease in the WBC count and a decrease in the platelet count. You have to think in terms of a dengue. And if the patient has an increase in the ESR, decrease in the ESR plus a WBC count, which is low, you have to think in terms of enteric fever. And if the patient's creatinine is raised, and if a clear-cut picture of conjunctival congestion is present, the patient has jaundice, think of leptospirosis. And malaria, of course, most of you are aware of it. Splenomegaly, typical fever, which is present on the every day or every alternate day at a particular time lasting for 2 or 3 hours. With chills and rigors, we can straight away go for malaria. A laboratory approach, we have to see in a resource-rich condition, we have to go, suppose if you're in the city, we can straight away go for a QBC for MP, blood culture, raised detectors and scrub typhus culture, RT-PCR. But in a resource-post condition, this is very, very important. A rapid card test is important. Here, we are not accepting the rapid cards, but a paracheck test in a place where all the facilities are not available, we have to still see that the patient's malaria test and the rapid card, and then you usually have to go for a treatment. Typhoid, you can go for LFT and CBC. Scrub typhus, IgA melissa. Lepto, again, IgA melissa. Influenza can go for an empirical treatment, and it can go for a rapid test. And dengue symptomatic treatment with hemoglobin PCV and platelet count. If the platelet count is decreasing, it is said a 6-day rule. The first 6 days are very, very important in dengue because this capillary leak usually occurs in 6 days. And if the patient doesn't have fever after 6 days, if the patient is devoid of fever, then the platelet count usually starts rising. And brucellosis is one of the conditions we have to think of. And when to think of dengue? Here, fever and any two criteria. This will be dealt in detail with the other speaker, Dr. Lakshmi Saujanya, Assistant Professor of Medicine. And these are the tests we have to go for. That's virus isolation, genome, NS1 detection, serology of IgM and IgG. But here, IgM is more important. And it is said that the serology of IgG stays in the patient for nearly another 60 years. If the patient is dengue positive now, IgG can be positive for another 60 years or almost lifelong. And these are the timelines for the dengue. IgM usually rises just after 3 days, and IgG after a few days. Approach to the management, right? Group A, mild symptomatic volume. You have to give adequate volume of oral fluids, and you can send the patient home. On home basis, you can treat him. Group T, if the warning signs are present, refer him to the hospital. And the group C, if the patient is going into a state of dengue hemorrhagic shock, he should be admitted to the intensive care unit and treated. And here, of course, we have to see the patient's SOFA score. And depending on that, we have to go for the fluid infusions as well as platelets as well as blood transfusion. And it is said that platelets, even though they are coming down up to 10,000, if the patient doesn't have any bleeding manifestations, he need not straight away go for a transfusion. And even if it's 20,000, if the patient has a bleeding tendency, straight away can go for a transfusion. But what they say is, unnecessarily, if you go for a platelet transfusion, it is said that after recovery, the recovery of the platelets also will be delayed. The patient's platelet count may not rise as needed. So you should not be in a hurry to go for a platelet transfusion in dengue fevers. So this is, you can see here, any fever lasting for more than 8 days of dengue, viral infection is less likely. And second case, 14 years male, fever, diarrhea of 4 days, febrile illness twice in the last 2 months, is treated with 5 days of antibiotics like levofloxacin, but still is febrile and he stays in a hostel. So GI symptoms are dominant here. So here we have to think in terms of typhoid. And due to time constraints, I'll skip off this one. And of course, we can go straight away for culture and sensitivity or urine culture and sensitivity. But remember, VIDAL should be done only 1 week after the onset of fever, because most of the cases, lab reports usually come 1 in 40 positive, 1 in 8 positive, 1 in 160 positive. But remember, we have to go for all the other things like a somatic O, capsular K, flagellar T. All these antigens should be more than 320. Then we have to go straight away for a typhoid or enteric treatment. So individuals less than 40, gradual onset of fever, 5 to 7 days, bowel disturbance. Eating the food outside is very, very important. And most of the cases will have splenomegaly. And here, you can see here, it's a step ladder pattern. If we go for a graph like this, we have a step ladder pattern of the fever, and fever lysis occurs after a few days. And the third case, a 62-year rural patient, agricultural job, 10 days fever. So once if we say the patient is an agricultural laborer, we have to think in terms of a scrub typhus. So you can see the platelet count also has decreased, but not up to the extent of less than 20,000. And what is more important is conjunctival suffusion and inguinal lymphadenopathy are present. So this takes us to scrub typhus. You can see when the patient is examined, an SR is present. So it usually occurs in the rainy season. Once again, bushwalkers, off-road tourists, Aboriginal people pursuing traditional lifestyles, and the rural residents in Asia Pacific region. All these patients are more prone for this scrub typhus. And when to think of leptospirosis? So people who are swimming and scuba diving, and who are mostly the time in the rain, and sailing, windsurfing. Of course, these are usually occurs in the Western countries. But even here also, we do see a lot of cases of leptospirosis. So the patient being brought with history of jaundice and creatinine being raised and CPK being raised, then we have to think of leptospirosis. So here we can see the basic tests. Hemoglobin TC/DC may be normal, platelets may be increased, but SGOT and SGPT are mixed pattern, and like IgM ELISA positive for day 5 to 7 onwards. But here we have to see false positive and false negative also. And take home message: when the patient is taking doxycycline, azithromycin, chloramphenicol for more than 48 to 70 hours and still febrile, diagnosis of scrub typhus and leptospirosis is unlikely. And last case, 18 years male, fever with shivering of 6 days. And so what will you do here? Headache, body pains, no dysuria, loss of appetite is present. He's febrile, shivering, no rash, but spleen is palpable. Straight away, the diagnosis is we can start on chloroquine. So this is still the best, like, even though the people say that we do have a loss of resistance to chloroquine, but what I have seen in my experiences, Vivax malaria still responds beautifully to chloroquine. And if the patient is a falciparum, you can start artemisate plus clindamycin. And lab test for malaria, the best gold standard till now is smear for MP. And now we have QBC for MP, the quantitative Buffy-Coat. And once if the species is known, we can easily treat the patient. What is more important is of late in the northeast states of India, a few cases of monkey malaria, that's Plasmodium knowlesi. It started in Thailand, and within a few months, it slowly ascended upwards towards Northeast India. Maybe in the coming few years, it may be another challenge to us. So management, we also know chloroquine resistant MAP, even though here we can see Visakhapatnam is chloroquine resistant, the red one, but still chloroquine does wonders in all these patients with malaria. So a good lab and an experienced technician, if available, peripheral smear is the best. And in a place where a situation where it is not available, you can straight away go for the Paracheck test. And clinical malaria is not a recognized medical entity and has resulted in a great overdiagnosis of malaria and diagnosis of other infections. So this is the study that's I have already sent: dengue, malaria, typhoid, and scrub typhus. And you can see the organisms that usually day in and day out fight with, cause a lot of problems and take away more of our lives. These are all the organisms that are present of the tropical diseases. But the one which is right now causing a lot of headache and sleepless nights for us is nothing else than the COVID. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Srinivas, for a very lucid and explicit presentation. And please stay back. We will have the discussion towards the end of the session. Okay. And now it's my pleasure to request Dr. Saujanya. Saujanya, can you share your screen? Dr. Yes, Saujanya, to tell us particularly about the dengue and how we differentiate that from the COVID-19 through which we are all going now. And as you know that there are many people who are really getting confused between these two when there is a fever initially. Please tell us as to how we go about diagnosing this particular condition or differentiate, rather provide the differential diagnosis to the dengue fever, which has become very rampant these days. Over to Dr. Saujanya.
Thank you, sir. Am I audible, sir?
Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
Yes, sir. So now thank you, sir. And sincere thanks to Principal, sir, for giving me this opportunity. And after a very detailed explanation by HOD, sir, I don't know how my presentation will be. I will try my best to see that I'll be doing the best. So to differentiate between COVID-19 and dengue, how to differentiate and manage. 1 minute. Sir. Yes. I'll be discussing this based upon the national guidelines of dengue case management during COVID-19 pandemic, as issued by the National Vector-Borne Disease Control Program by Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, Government of India. It was published in 20th October 2020. Now, coming on to the epidemiology of the dengue, we know that dengue is endemic in all states of our country and in all the union territories in the country except Lakshadweep and Ladakh, where on and off outbreaks have been reported. And dengue has a seasonal pattern, maximum cases being reported after the monsoon, especially during the period of July and November. This session very important because now we are having increasing number of cases of dengue being reported. At the same time, we are having a doubt whether we are entering into third wave of COVID again. And the dengue is not uniformly distributed throughout the year. So here we are able to see that India is totally endemic for dengue viral diseases. Coming on to COVID-19 and dengue, both diseases share many similarities in signs and symptoms. Even in pathogenesis, they share many mechanisms and pathways for progression and severity of the disease. And therefore, the clinical diagnosis and management have become a challenging task. In dengue-prone zones, we don't know a person who has recovered from one illness will likely contract the other one, or an individual might have both the illnesses together. That is a coexistent dengue COVID. So just going on briefly, dengue, we know it is caused by a Flaviviridae. It belongs to Flaviviridae. Dengue viruses 1, 2, 3, and 4 serotypes are available. And a person can be infected with dengue virus multiple times, at least 4 times in his or her lifetime. And COVID-19, it is a coronavirus disease, 2019 COVID-19. It is respiratory illness which is caused by coronavirus called SARS-CoV-2. And how does it spread? Dengue usually spreads by bite of mosquitoes, that is Aedes aegypti. And COVID-19 is usually through respiratory droplets which are produced by an infected person. When he coughs, sneezes, or talks, the respiratory droplets become the source of infection. So mosquito bites for dengue, and it is the respiratory droplet for COVID-19. Coming on to the signs and symptoms, the most common symptom of dengue is fever with any of the following: aches, pains, nausea and vomiting, and rash. And people with COVID-19, they have a wide range of symptoms, and symptoms usually appear 2 to 14 days after exposure to virus in COVID-19. Symptoms of dengue usually last for 2 to 7 days. As our HOD sir has rightly said, after 7 days, if fever persists, most probably we may not think of dengue and other viral etiologies as such. So COVID-19, we see fever with chills, cough, shortness of breath or difficulty in breathing, fatigue with muscle body aches, headache, loss of taste or smell, sore throat, congestion or nose, nausea or vomiting, and diarrhea. And we have some warning signals also in dengue. In dengue, the most important thing is we should watch for warning signs after 24 to 48 hours of subsidence of, as long as fever is there, patient might be stable. But after 24 to 48 hours, after the fever subsides, patient will develop warning signals in the form of stomach pain, tenderness, vomiting, or bleeding from mucosal membranes. He may feel tired, restless. Similarly, we have some warning features in COVID-19 also, like troubled breathing, persistent pain or pressure in chest, confusion, inability to wake or stay awake, like he will be having drowsiness, and cyanosis might be there. Now, what symptoms and signs and what will be the features which distinguish dengue and COVID-19 as such? So when we have fever, we know that dengue usually we have high-grade fevers. COVID-19 might be high grade, but sometimes it might be very low-grade fever. Patient may just complain that I had rigors, that's all. I don't remember history of fever, madam, but I have dry cough and I have a headache, I have body pains. So this fever, if it is very high grade, most probably it is dengue fever. Then coming on to the headache, it is retroorbital headache, which is typical of dengue fever. And in COVID-19, the headache is usually frontoparietal. History of loss of smell and taste, it goes mostly in favor of COVID-19, and it is not seen in dengue fevers usually. History of bone pains and joint pains usually points towards dengue fever. As we know, dengue fever is a breakbone fever with severe debilitating joint pains. And this severe joint pains like breakbone fever, low back pain and all may not be present in COVID-19. Fatigue is usually a feature of all viral fevers, but in COVID-19, the fatigue, the exhaustion is to such an extent that once you are off your job, you just feel like lying down and you don't feel like getting up. Such severe exhaustion and fatigue is usually typical of COVID-19 infections. Dry cough is a feature of COVID-19 and to a lesser extent in other in dengue fever. And abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, though seen in some cases of COVID-19, we have to keep in mind they may be the warning signs of dengue fever also. So the warning signs, as we have already I have already said, in dengue we have pain abdomen, bleeding from mucous membranes, hypotension, and vomitings. In COVID-19, it is persistent fever beyond 5 days or 6 days with cough, shortness of breath, falling saturations. And rash might be seen in both the cases, but dengue rash with thrombocytopenia is more common. COVID-19 is a hypercoagulable state with arteriovenous thrombosis being very common. Both being viral diseases, both of them can lead on to dehydration. And because of dehydration, acute kidney injury can be seen in both dengue and COVID-19 also. Then once we go for investigation part of it, liver enzymes, SGOT will be more than SGPT in both the conditions. In dengue fevers, usually the rise will be more than 2 times compared to COVID-19 unless it is drug induced. Ultrasound abdomen, usually we see in viral dengue fevers, we see gallbladder wall edema with ascites, pleural effusion and pericardial effusions are very common. In COVID-19, the serositis features are comparatively less and pleural effusion usually doesn't go in favor of COVID-19. Usually, some cases we may see, and HRCT chest if done, we can see COVID-related lung changes and all will be there in COVID-19, may not be that significant in dengue fevers. And lastly, the diagnostic test. Once we go to the diagnostic test, if in less than 5 days of onset of illness, the confirmatory test is NS1 antigen ELISA or RT-PCR for dengue viral disease. And if the duration of illness is more than 5 days, we need to go ahead with same capture ELISA test. And the specimen will be either blood or serum for dengue fevers. And for COVID-19, it is an nasopharyngeal or a oropharyngeal swab for RT-PCR. Moreover, whatever is said and done, it is the history taking with typical symptoms which the diagnosis can usually be picked up. So coming on to the case definitions of dengue fever, dengue infection, we know in either of the cases, in dengue COVID, 70% of the cases might be asymptomatic or mild. Most of the cases might be asymptomatic. So in symptomatic cases, we classify the dengue infections into mild, moderate, and severe. Mild cases usually have fever of 2 to 7 days duration with either nausea, vomiting, rash, headache, retroorbital pains, myalgias, arthralgias, or leukopenias. In moderate cases of dengue, again, we have 2 possibilities. One is dengue fever with warning signs and symptoms. The other one is dengue fever with high-risk comorbid conditions, that's all. So high-risk comorbid conditions are usually infancy, old age, pregnancy, patients who are on immunosuppressive drugs or chronic infections and chronic illnesses like coronary artery disease or a patient with any coagulation disorder. Now, the warning signs of dengue which make them moderate in severity, it includes recurrent vomiting, abdominal pain or tenderness with lethargy and restlessness, mild pleural effusions, minor bleeding from any side, and for this we usually clinically we go ahead with tourniquet test. So tourniquet test is what we do is just tie the apparatus cuff to the patient's hand, and you just raise the BP cuff, just systolic and diastolic blood pressures, and just to the mean of both systolic blood pressure plus diastolic blood pressure by 2, we do it, and just raise the cuff just above the value. And if you see more than 10 petechial spots in a 1-inch area, usually it goes in favor of dengue. And to be more precise, if more than 20 spots are identified in 1-inch area, it is very significant. And here comes the law of 20 for dengue fever. So petechial rashes, petechial spots more than 20 per 1-inch area, or cold clammy extremities, rapid pulse. If we know the baseline pulse of the person, and if the pulse rate is increased by more than 20 beats per minute, it indicates that he is ending up in, he is having a red flag sign. A narrow pulse pressure, if the difference between systolic and diastolic blood pressures is less than 20. Hypotension, if a fall in systolic blood pressure by more than 20 millimeters of mercury, then if the presence of hepatomegaly, progressive increase in hematocrit by more than 20%, or rapid fall in platelet count to less than 20,000 per millimeter cube. These indicate that patient is having warning signs. These are the red flag signs which indicate that patient needs admission, and this moderate cases need into hospital. So coming on to the severe cases, any case of dengue fever with one or more of the following: patient with shock, that is undetectable pulse, narrow pulse pressure and hypotension, with severe or multiple organ involvements, or severe bleeding like hematemesis, massive menorrhagia, or melena. Now, we have said patient with multi-organ involvement is a severe case of dengue. So this is dengue syndrome, and what are the various organs that can be involved in dengue? In CNS involvement can be there in the form of encephalopathy, encephalitis, or IC bleeds because of thrombocytopenia. GIT involvement can be there because of acute hepatitis, fulminant hepatic failure, cholecystitis, and cholangitis. Renal involvement in the form of AKI and hemolytic uremic syndromes, and ATN is very common. Any viral fever as such can cause viral myocarditis with cardiomyopathies, arrhythmias, and pericardial effusion. Respiratory involvement, as we all know, pulmonary edema, ARDS, and pulmonary hemorrhages are very common. And in eye, conjunctival bleeds, macular hemorrhages, and optic neuritis with visual impairment or with expanded dengue syndrome. Once we come to COVID also we have mild, moderate, and severe diseases. So mild disease, upper respiratory tract symptoms will be there without any shortness of breath or hypoxia. In moderate cases of COVID, we have patients with respiratory rate more than 24 per minute. Patient complain of breathlessness, and their SpO2 is usually less than 94% on the room air. And severe cases where the respiratory rate is more than 30 per minute, SpO2 less than 90% on room air. So these are the three categories. Mild cases can be managed at home. Moderate cases need ward admission, and severe cases need admission usually in ICU. So apart from this, based upon the clinical features, stage 3 or the severe cases, even inflammatory cytokines and biomarkers like interleukin 2, interleukin 6, interleukin 6, all this, if they are significantly elevated, patient will be in severe COVID, and he needs ICU admission directly. So at this stage, shock, respiratory failure, and even cardiopulmonary collapse can occur. So what are the values, biochemical values that indicate that patient is having severe COVID? If the D-dimer is more than 1000 nanograms per ml, CRP value more than 100 milligram per ml, LDH more than 245, troponin and CPK more than twice the upper limit of normal, and if ferritin is more than 500 micrograms per liter, or this is very important. In COVID, we have absolute lymphocyte count less than 800 per microliter, the normal range being 1800 to 7700 per microliter. And what are the extra pulmonary manifestations of COVID? Because even in dengue, we have seen extra, all organs are involved. Similarly, in COVID also, any organ can be involved, and patient may present with CNS complications like neuralgias, epilepsies, headaches, strokes, encephalitis, encephalopathy. However, loss of smell and loss of taste is usually seen in COVID, but not in dengue. Even in COVID, patient may present with syndromes. Patient may have myalgia and myopathy, and cardiac involvement will be there in the form of myocarditis, myocardial inflammations with DVT and venous thromboembolisms, because this is a hypercoagulable state. Patient may also have thrombocytopenias, and patient may land up with MI because of coagulopathies. And coming on to the endocrine manifestations, patients may develop diabetes with adrenal insufficiency and thyrotoxicosis. Patient may present with abdominal pain. I said dengue, it is more common, but even in COVID also, abdominal pain and microvascular steatosis can be there. Patient may have diarrhea, may have nausea, and pancreatic injury may occur even with SARS-CoV-2. Similarly, skin manifestations like macular rash with petechia and urticaria may occur even in COVID-19 also. And renal involvement in the form of AKI, ATN, and renal cortical necrosis with hematuria and proteinuria can occur with COVID-19. So, do you think the co-infection of dengue and COVID occur? Is it really a public health challenge as such? Why we need to discuss this topic at this point of time? Co-infections of dengue and COVID-19 have been reported from various states of India like Assam, Chandigarh, Daman and Diu, Delhi, and all these areas they have reported before last year itself. They have reported co-infected cases of dengue and COVID-19. Apart from the cases being reported, they have reported even deaths due to COVID-19 having co-infection with dengue. The states have reported are Assam, Maharashtra, Punjab, and Delhi. All the states, they have reported deaths. So just one slide, I would like to just about the pathogenesis in both these things. They have common pathogenesis also. Apart from signs and symptoms being similar, the common pathogenesis also is there. Wherein in dengue hemorrhagic fever, dengue virus causes direct destruction of platelets in the periphery. It causes bone marrow suppression with decreased megakaryosis and activation of immune cells leading on to inflammatory mediators and increased vascular permeability leading on to plasma leakage, thrombocytopenia, causing coagulopathy. Patient may land up with severe bleeding and death. Similarly, in COVID-19 also, SARS-CoV-2 can directly cause endothelial damage, causing apoptosis of platelets and thrombocytopenia. It can directly cause inhibition of bone marrow growth, leading on to thrombocytopenia. It can cause activation of immune cells, leading to inflammatory mediators, vascular permeability, and plasma leakage. Similarly, it can even cause macrophage activation syndrome, leading on to coagulopathies. And in COVID-19, we have a hypercoagulable state, resulting in thromboembolism and arterial thrombosis. Whereas in dengue fever, we have disseminated intravascular coagulation, consumptive coagulopathy, severe bleeding, and death might be seen in dengue hemorrhagic fevers. So what is the impact of co-infection on the severity of the disease? Antibody-dependent enhancement might be there. And as we know, in dengue fevers, after first fever, second infection is more dangerous, and patient may be having poorer prognosis with recurrent dengue fevers, and that is usually attributed to antibody-dependent enhancements. And we don't know what antibody-dependent enhancement will, whether this will play a role in a co-infection of dengue and COVID. And this needs further studies to evaluate this. Now, the diagnostic approach to co-infection, when a patient comes with acute febrile illness, it should be kept in mind. What needs to be kept in mind is what are the various endemic diseases of that region, and seasonal outbreak pattern of infectious diseases in that region should be kept in mind, and the diagnostic test should be chosen accordingly. So, if a person is coming with acute febrile illness, in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic, once the patient says that I have a very high fever, then the first thing what we are going to do is get him, if the symptoms are going in favor of COVID-19, get his swab for RT-PCR or rapid antigen test done immediately. At least if rapid antigen test is done, if it is negative, based upon the endemic diseases, we can think of we can assess clinically for other diseases. However, if clinical suspicion for COVID persists, we can go for repeat COVID tests. However, if rapid antigen and RT-PCR is positive, and still you have suspicion for dengue in this case based upon the symptoms, because in view of joint pains or retroorbital pains, typical morbilliform rash, patient presenting with bleeding manifestations, patient complaining of severe pain abdomen, which is going typically in form of serositis with nausea, vomiting, and patient is not having respiratory symptoms to the extent which we expect, or in hematology, if the patient is showing raised hematocrit or thrombocytopenia, which makes a suspicion for dengue more likely, then we can go ahead with NS1 and IgM testing. And if either of them is positive, we can say that it is a dengue and COVID co-infection. However, if person is positive for COVID-19 and still you have suspicion for other diseases like malaria, typhoid, leptospirosis, scrub, chikungunya, or even the presence of other localizing signs, we need to go ahead with other tests also to rule out coexisting other viral diseases or other diseases of that endemic area, though they are positive for COVID-19. So co-infection, it can be asymptomatic co-infection or symptomatic co-infection with predominant coronaviral disease, predominant dengue viral disease, or codominant co-infections as such. So treatment, before initiation of treatment, severity of co-infection should be assessed by signs, symptoms, and investigational parameters. The treatment protocol is planned as per the dominancy and severity of infection, whether it is either dengue dominant or COVID-19 dominant or both. So we have various parameters, mild, moderate, severe dengue being classified as D1, D2, D3, and COVID-19 being classified as C1, C2, C3, mild, moderate, and severe. And which one is dominating based on that, the treatment usually depends. So if it is dengue fever, and the patient is having hemorrhagic spots, thrombocytopenia is there, and hematocrit rises more than 20%. The basic concept for dengue fever management is it is by IV fluids usually. So initiate the IV therapy at the rate of 6 ml per kg per hour crystalloid solution for 1 to 2 hours and check hematocrit. If hematocrit is improving, it is well and good. and we can just decrease the fluid rates to 3 ml per kg per hour. And if there is further improvement, we can discontinue the fluids. However, if hematocrit is not improving, we can increase the IV fluids to 10 ml per kg per hour. If still there is no improvement and hematocrit falls, if you suspect internal hemorrhage, we need to go ahead with blood transfusions at the rate of 10 ml per kg whole blood or 5 ml per kg packed RBCs. And if improvement is seen, it is well and good. However, if improvement is usually seen, and successively we can decrease the fluid rates to 3 ml per kg per hour, and fluids can be discontinued after 24 to 48 hours. However, if the person is having, if he is in compensated shock, again, the fluid rate should be 10 to 20 ml, and based on hematocrit, we may either increase the fluid rates to 10 to 20 ml per kg, or we may gradually requirements. However, if suspected bleeding is there, blood transfusions have to be taken up. Still, if there is refractory hypotension, we need to check the acidosis. We need to see if there is any bleeding. We need to go ahead with calcium and other electrolyte monitorings. And still, if there is no improvement in vital signs, we may need inotrope support in case of compensated shock. If the person is in decompensated shock as such, we need to give IV fluids as rapid bolus over 15 to 30 minutes. We give 10 to 20 ml per kg body weight. If we see if there is improvement in vitals, if vitals improve, we can gradually taper the bolus doses to normal doses and gradually to 3 ml per kg per hour, and we can further discontinue IV fluids after 24 to 48 hours. However, if there's no improvement in vitals even after the bolus doses, we need to check the hematocrit. If hematocrit is still falling and you suspect bleeding, go for blood transfusions. Refractory hypotension and no improvement in vital signs usually needs inotrope supports. If improvement in vital signs is observed, we can gradually taper the crystalloids slowly. So management of COVID as such, we know mild cases can be managed at home itself. Home isolation and care can be provided. For moderate cases, they need admission in ward, and cases being admitted in ward usually need oxygen support because on roommate the saturation is usually less than 34%. So target SpO2 will be usually 92 to 96%. However, in COPD cases, the target can be 88 to 92%. So awake proning is usually encouraged for all the persons who are admitted in wards, and anti-inflammatory or immunomodulatory therapy is usually advised. We go for dexamethasone 6 milligrams per day for 5 to 10 days as such, or any equivalent of dexamethasone can be used. Anticoagulation, usually the prophylactic dose is usually sufficient. That's what the studies usually say. And we need to monitor them with serial X-rays, HRCT chest and blood parameters, and the hemodynamic stability needs to be assessed. However, for severe cases which are admitted in ICUs, where the saturation is falling to less than 90% on room air, patient needs respiratory support, patient needs oxygen, patient may need high flow oxygen devices, patient may be on NIV. So here also we need to give dexamethasone, and within 24 to 48 hours of admission into ICU, nowadays we can give baricitinib and tocilizumab can be given. If they need to be given, they should be given within 24 to 48 hours based upon the inflammatory marker levels. And anticoagulation also, it is usually prophylactic dose is usually sufficient. We can give enoxaparin 0.5 milligram per kg per dose subcutaneous twice daily if necessary. Other supportive measures needs to be continued, and sugar levels have to be maintained strictly, and serial monitorings with serial X-rays and HRCT to be done if there is clinical worsening. Otherwise, lab monitors like CRP, D-dimers and all need to be measured sequentially, and based on the improvement, patient needs to be, the treatment needs to be titrated. Now, what is this monoclonal antibodies and in whom are using this monoclonal antibodies? Monoclonal antibodies therapy for COVID-19 is being advocated to mild to moderate COVID-19 patients, adult patients who are not hospitalized, but who are at risk for progression to hospitalization as such. Monoclonal antibodies are contraindicated in patients who are hospitalized and in whom there is need for oxygen therapy, or if patient is already on chronic oxygen therapy, these monoclonal antibodies are usually contraindicated. The things which are the monoclonal antibodies which are available for us are casirivimab and imdevimab, are already available in some government hospitals in our state. And to whom do we give this? So these are given to high-risk population before admission. That is, if a person is having BMI of more than 35, patient is having a chronic kidney disease, patient is diabetic, patient is immunosuppressive or receiving immunosuppressive treatment, or patient's age is more than 65 years, patient is having only mild symptoms, but you think that he is a high-risk candidate who may land up with moderate to severe COVID findings and may go into admission. So in these cases, we can give, or a person with age more than 55 years and cardiovascular disease or hypertension or COPD or other chronic respiratory diseases. In the age group of 12 to 17 years, if the BMI is more than 85th percentile, or if the child is known case of sickle cell disease or congenital heart disease, in these patients also we can consider monoclonal antibodies. There is no need for admission for administration of monoclonal antibodies, just IV over 1 hour and monitor for 1 hour after administration to watch for any reactions, including anaphylaxis, and this can be administered on a OP basis itself. And the latest updates are the monoclonal antibodies are being used for post-exposure prophylaxis against SARS-CoV-2 also. The FDA has issued emergency usage permission to use monoclonal antibodies, that is casirivimab and imdivimab, to prevent SARS-CoV-2 infection. In any person who is more than 12 years of age, who is exposed to SARS-CoV-2 infection and who is at risk of severe COVID-19 infections and have either not been vaccinated or expected to have inadequate immune response to vaccination. In these people, we can use post-exposure prophylaxis. We can use monoclonal antibodies also. So for management of co-infection, the treatment is mainly dependent on severity or predominant infection. We have to see which one is dominating. Is it dengue or is it COVID-19? If it is co-infection as such. And some of the general principles, as we have already discussed, fluid therapy to be given in co-infection cases depending upon the hemodynamic status of the patient. Always, whatever the guidelines might be, we need to individualize the patients. The care has to be individualized to the patient based upon the bedside clinical features of the individual. Nothing can be all or none phenomenon as such. So the fluid therapy to be given in co-infection, it depends upon the hemodynamic status of the patient and degree of severity. So we may follow the fluid charts as we have already discussed for dengue fever for most co-infection cases. And it is only in the presence of SARI with COVID-19 that we need to be careful with aggressive fluid management, as it may lead to worsening of oxygenation in COVID-19. And aggressive fluid resuscitation is recommended for COVID-19 patients if they are in shock for initial resuscitation. And when we come to Lomarin, here is something which we need to be very careful. Low molecular weight heparin is being used in the management of moderate to severe COVID-19 cases as it is associated with increased thrombosis. It is indicated in moderate to severe categories usually, but we need to be very careful. Low molecular weight heparin, when we are giving, we need to monitor D-dimer levels carefully, and especially when the platelet counts are less than 1 lakh per millimeter cube, we need to be doubly careful. And in case of co-infections with active bleeds, like if the person is having, if person complains that he is having hematochezia, he says he is having petechiae, then low molecular weight heparin needs to be discontinued immediately. As I said, everything is bedside clinical management. Clinical observation of the person is something which is very important in management of co-infections, or in this condition where COVID-19 is pandemic and we have other diseases also coexisting with COVID-19. And use of corticosteroids, usually steroids can be continued as per COVID-19 management guidelines, and it may be withheld based on the clinical condition. Clinical conditions like if the person is having active infections, or dexamethasone can be given safely if dengue viremic stages cross, that is after 5 to 6 days of dengue illness. Corticosteroids can safely be given even if it is a dengue coexistence in COVID-19. Tocilizumab and baricitinib also, they can be used in patients requiring oxygen support. Only if eGFR is less than 15 ml per minute, we need to think of these two drugs. Otherwise, there is no contraindication to use of these drugs if there is dengue co-infection. And to conclude, there is a strong likelihood of temporal co-occurrence of 2 or more infections together in a given region, and a great alert vigil is necessary with a high index of suspicion, and physicians need to be constantly aware of possibility of co-infections, and it is bedside clinical examination of the patient which is going to make us know which drug can be given and which drug need to be stopped. And before all those things, efforts must be made to minimize the vector population before the onset of rise, thus resulting the lowering in number of dengue, malaria, and chikungunya cases. And as we all know, prevention is always better than cure. So go for SMS, that is sanitization, masks, and spacing should be there. And apart from that, there should be vector control also. So with this few words, I I thank Principal Sir for giving me this opportunity. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Saujanya, for your elaborate exposition on the subject. And we saw in the beginning of your presentation the table where you have mentioned the different symptomatology, signs and symptoms of COVID-19 and dengue fever. And I request each one of the participants to keep that in mind and have a good clinical examination to understand and keep it at the back of your mind that could this be the same or could this be something else. So with that in your mind, once you know and once you diagnose appropriately, I'm sure the treatment is something which you're all used to doing. So I'm sure you have to keep that particular table in your mind. If you want to have any reference of what has been said so far, all these are being recorded and it is there on the YouTube. The YouTube address is Andhra Medical College, Visakhapatnam channel. If you go to YouTube and type this particular Andhra Medical College, Visakhapatnam channel, you can view this particular these proceedings, the lecture that has been given by all these three lecturers, as well as our previous ones as well, the weekly webinars that we are conducting. So if you want to go back and refer, you have a ready reckoner in the YouTube. So thank you very much, Lakshmi Saujanya, for that elaborate discussion. And now I would request our Professor of Community Medicine, Dr. Y. Padmasri, to speak on the preventive aspects of the common seasonal fevers with reference to the dengue.
Thank you, sir. So I start with where Dr. Saujanya has ended. Okay, I taking forward the message given by her, prevention is better than cure. I put it here as the prevention puzzle because as we all are aware that prevention is better than cure, okay, but still it remained very elusive. There is always a huge gap between our expectations and the outcomes. Why it is so? So mostly it is because of inconsistent behavior of the individuals as well as the collective effort of the community. So for the prevention of diseases, mostly it is required the awareness among the public and the individuals and working towards the control of the, prevention of the diseases individually as well as collectively. So I want to first present the guidelines given by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare recently for the prevention of seasonal epidemic prone diseases. So as we are all now well aware, it is the major co-infections that are possible with the COVID are the dengue, malaria, seasonal influenza, leptospirosis, chikungunya, and scrub in certain areas. So the guidelines say that the basic preventive measures for COVID-19 and as well as the seasonal influenza must be ensured at all times. So it is not the time to go back to the usual routine. People are falling into their usual routine. That should be avoided. We need to still avoid the large or huge gatherings. We need to maintain the physical distance, wear the mask, and also hand hygiene and cough etiquette are very, very important. And more added to that, the adults now, so please go for the vaccine. And one more thing, it is also being recommended to the pregnant women, so they can also be taken care of. Even though you had disease, you can take the vaccine because the natural response is varied. So the vaccine acts as a booster. So as soon as you recover from the COVID-19, you can have the vaccine. The recommended period is 3 months after disease has subsided. Okay, and then vaccination for the seasonal influenza for healthcare workers and other high risk individuals, especially the older individuals or the senior citizens. So it has to be implemented aggressively. And coming to the vector control, source reduction of the mosquito breeding sites as along with the adult control measures, adult mosquito control measures, especially in and around the treatment facilities, is a must. And for the personal protection, you can always use the insect repellents and the insecticide treated nets wherever they are available. And one more disease we are afraid of is the leptospirosis. So preventive measures against leptospirosis include wearing protective clothing, who are at occupational risk like sanitation workers and the agricultural workers who grow paddy and sugarcane. And most importantly, avoidance of swimming in water when you think it is contaminated. For all these, the prevention, especially the community support, must be garnered by community awareness drives, and community participation is very much needed. Added to all these preventive measures, the integrated surveillance and response, which aims at defining, detecting, and responding to the communicable public threats, would aid us to recognize the disease, the infections very early and react to it or respond to it in a manner that we nip it in the bud. So it must be ensured that IDSP networks are strengthened to include the surveillance of COVID-19 cases. Also, now, usually they will do that for dengue, malaria, chikungunya, leptospirosis, etc. Vector surveillance and monitoring of the vector susceptibility to insecticide should also be an integral part of the program, because the vector control measures are most important in the prevention of all the vector-borne diseases, especially dengue and malaria. So coming to the dengue, which is the recently very increasing in the occurrence of the disease or the incidence, and this has been observed in cases, and it is one of the currently fastest spreading mosquito-borne viral disease. That's why WHO has included dengue virus in its list of the world top 10 public health threats in 2015. So this is the table showing the year-wise dengue cases of Visakhapatnam district. If you notice, fortunately in 2020, as you all know, the season for dengue is from June to November. Fortunately, we have less number of cases in 2020. Thanks to the people who remained indoors, there was no littering of the public spaces. And that's why there was no peri-domestic collections of water. We were able to have a number of cases. So that needs to be continued once again, I wish to say that. But look at now. So the cases are slowly increasing number in August. By August, 2 days before, we have already reported 137 cases of dengue. Unfortunately, malaria cases are such as dengue, but still they are also been showing up. So they were around 20 cases, I think, during the this 1 year. So we need to look at dengue mostly in relation to the prevention. So we need to understand the vector, the dengue vector, its habitat, and then only we can see what prevention measures can be adapted. So as you all know, Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus are the two vectors of dengue. So Aedes aegypti, they do not fly far. They remain within 300 to 400 meters of where they emerged. So this gives us the clue to how much of source reduction measures we have to take. And Aedes aegypti almost entirely feed on human beings. They are anthropophilic and they feed mainly during the daylight, both indoors and outdoors. This is also very important to notice. and they are frequent biters. They just don't stop at taking one meal, so they frequently bite the human beings. They tend to rest outdoors and inhabit both domestic and periodic artificial containers, as well as the natural receptacles such as tree holes and plants. Coming to the Aedes albopictus, it was originally a rural mosquito, but it has adapted to the urban areas, and now it is one of the common vectors in the peri-urban areas. So it also has the similar characteristics as Aedes aegypti, but please note that it is not as much as anthropophilic as Aedes aegypti. It is a heterophilic mosquito. So maybe it may not be responsible for widespread epidemics. So how to control this? If you notice the life cycle of the Aedes mosquito, it takes about 7 to 10 days to cover its entire life cycle from the egg stage to the adult. So this provides us a period of 7 to 10 days to take care of the artificial emissions of water. So we say that weekly disposal of emptying of all the artificial collections, dry. So we observe a weekly dry day. So that will take care of the larvae becoming the adults. So what are the vector control measures? We have the source reduction, which means that we remove all the small collections of water in the domestic as well as the peri-domestic areas. That would be the most effective and efficient method of controlling the Aedes mosquito. Mosquito proofing of water storage containers if we cannot empty them, and the mosquito larvicides that are suitable for treating of drinking water or Temifos, which can be used at 1 milligram per liter, and also the Bacillus thuringiensis, which can be used at 1 to 5 milligrams per liter. And the personal protective measures would help us in a long way. Still remember, because it is a day biter, so we can't take as much or enough care. So we need to be aware that, especially for children, we need to use either the mosquito repellents or the long sleeves or the mosquito nets while sleeping, even during the daytime. So this picture shows you that no mosquitoes, no dengue. So do your part by cleaning up all the mosquito breeding sites. It is important once a week. It is important to empty water storage containers. You clean it thoroughly before refilling, and you need to reseal them carefully. Clean the insides of the flower vases, plants, pots or pet balls, and change the water. Clean the drains and gutters which are out. Disposal, or if unused containers and objects that can accumulate water, if they can be disposed of, please do that. If they cannot be done, thrown away, they need to be protected from rain. So please remember, even a bottle cap can contain enough water for a mosquito to breed. Very, very small collections of water is just enough for the Aedes aegypti to breed. And one more thing is, like, it has a very long life. The eggs are very resistant to the drying, and they would stay for a long time. Coming to the space spraying or fogging, it is recommended only in the to suppress an ongoing epidemic or to prevent the incipient one. As I already told you, the most effective measure would be the source reduction acting at the larval stages. The treatment cycle is on day 0, 2 and 7 until the cases come down or declining trend is observed. And further application should then be made like once or twice a week to sustain the suppression of the adult vector population. Space spraying should focus on areas where people congregate, that is high density housing, schools, hospitals, etc. And wherever the densities are reported, or if you observe the vector density is more in those areas. And selective space treatment, as I told you, the it is around 300 to 400 meters that the vector can move. So around up to 400 meters from houses, if the spray spray can be done, it would be helpful for us to contain the epidemic, which is this is called as perifocal spray. But again, please remember that this is not a routine measure to be recommended. It is only for emergency situations. Why I am repeating this is people would ask for fogging, blaming the government or blaming the departments for not doing so, but that is useful only for emergency situations, not in a routine way. At the institutional level, we also need to take care. Again, the same larval habitats, covering all water tanks with mosquito-proof lids, checking for clogged gutters and flat roofs that may have poor drainage, and putting tight-fitting screens or wire mesh on doors and windows, supporting fogging or spraying activities if they are conducted by relevant authorities during the outbreaks. So again, as I told you, the community involvement and community participation is very, very crucial for us to control to prevent the dengue. So there should be a continuous interaction between the health personnel and the community so that people accept the Aedes control programs as their own program. They should be involved in the task of elimination of Aedes breeding places in and around their houses. And behavior change communication is the key to achieve all such community involvement as well as the community participation. So this is all about the prevention of especially the dengue, because that is creating lot of confusion and maybe leading to difficulties in management as a co-infection for COVID. So that's why I concentrated on the prevention of dengue and the vector for dengue. So let me end that a concerted effort in prevention, surveillance and behavior change communication, as well as a high index of suspicion and constant awareness of the possibility of co-infection. These will minimize the occurrence of COVID as well as the co-infections and thereby reduce the morbidity and mortality. So I thank sir for Principal Sir for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Padma Shri, for that very lucid presentation and with lot of points to be noted and lot of messages that need to be understood by all our friends. So let us see the chat box. Are there anything in chat box? I saw one comment by Dr. Bhagyalakshmi, who said that in typhoid it is the leukopenia with the relative lymphocytosis that needs to be kept in mind. Okay, so it is a leukopenia. The white blood cell count will come down with relatively increased lymphocytes. Okay, if there are any questions, you can feel free to ask the speakers directly by unmuting yourself. So unmute yourself and ask the question so that they'll be ready to answer. Maleshwara, are you there? Yeah, Maleshwara,
yes,
you can.
Sir. Yeah, sir. In dengue, it is platelet count is not so, but everybody is stressing more on the platelets.
Maleshwara, please be a little loud.
Sir, I am audible.
Now it's better.
Okay, sir. Sir, in dengue management, every clinician usually speak about platelet count. In my practice in rural area, I see a lot of patients of dengue, but platelet count even 3,000 also not harmful, sir. I usually admit patients even with 3,000 count. The most hazardous, dangerous complication for dengue is hypotension. The patient develop hypotension, that is more dangerous. Even the platelet count is 1 lakh, the patient develop severe hypotension, it is very difficult to bring him up. So you always keep that the patient's blood pressure should be always maintained normally, and the pulse pressure should be maintained normally. This is my version, sir. Platelet transfusions are not so important.
Yeah. No, Malleswara, you are saying
Sir,
that there are, I have admitted people with 3,000 platelets
Yes,
also,
sir,
that
yes, sir.
you said. Now, are you going to give them the platelet transfusions at that time or not?
I don't give, sir. As long as the patient
What
is
are,
stable,
what are the indications for platelet transfusion in dengue fever,
sir,
according to
whenever
you?
patient is any massive bleed like
Little loud,
GI,
please, little loud.
sir, any GI bleed or any severe epistaxis or any usually GI bleed, so there is a hematemesis or melena, then I give blood as well as platelets, sir.
Yeah. Saujanya, what do the guidelines say? What do the guidelines say about the transfusion uh, of platelets in dengue fever?
The guidelines say that if the platelet count is less than 10,000, patient needs platelet transfusion usually because the risk of massive bleed is usually there.
Yeah. So
Even
that
if the
is,
platelet counts are more than 20,000, and if the patient is having bleeding manifestations, it is better we go ahead with transfusions.
yeah.
However, as sir said, blood pressure should be monitored, pulse pressure should be taken into account, and it is a fluid management that forms the basis for the management of dengue fever. But at platelet count of 3,000, keeping it in a peripheral hospital, I think it is very risky, and guidelines also don't support that, sir.
Yeah.
I agree.
So, yeah.
Sir,
So here,
one fortunate thing about this platelet count, sir. So people who have a less in platelet count and a bleeding tendency, we have not seen intracranial bleeds, sir. Otherwise, we would have lost a lot of patients by this time. Fortunately, even in the textbooks also they say even though the platelet count is very much decreased, people dying with intracranial bleeds is very less when compared to the other thing. But the guidelines say less than 10,000, we can go for a platelet transfusion.
yeah, I think this point has to be understood by people that if it is less than 10,000, one has to go for the platelet transfusion, and if it is less than 20,000 or with bleed, they should go for this. Is there any reason? Is there any hypothesis which tells us as to why the intracranial bleeds are not so often in these patients with lower platelet counts, though there is bleeding elsewhere? Is there any hypothesis to suggest us that why the intracranial bleeds are less?
I've seen a lot of literature, sir, but nowhere it has been given that why it is so less. But intracranial bleeds are definitely less. And what they say, if we are in a hastened process to go for a platelet transfusion, what happens is when the patient recovers, the bone marrow may not be able to sustain and increase the platelet count as early as possible. So we'll be suppressing the macrophages, in fact.
Dr. Narsingarao from Jimsar has unmuted his phone. He can go ahead and ask a question if he wants. Sir, Dr. Chittupanthulu, sir is there. He is also unmuted. If he is going to ask a question, sir, please go ahead, sir.
No, sir, I want to have a comment on this, sir.
Yeah, please.
The earlier, we had a lot of experience in the initial stages in 1964. We are the first people to isolate this dengue virus from Visakhapatnam. Published in ICMR journal in 1966, myself and Dr. Kopach Master, Krishnamurthy Garu, and others. Right? So that is about that 60 years I have seen dengue fevers. So we now telling about this platelet counts, it is very good to talk 3,000, 10,000 patients survives everything. But what about the patient attitude? They will eat your brain in the morning and evening, even it is 1,40,000. It's very difficult to convince these people. There is no indication, even if it is 30,000, the patient condition is okay, there is no need, even 20,000 is okay. But how to rescue yourself? Suppose at the 10,000, 20,000, you don't give, the patient dies, then it go on making a lot of noise. So it's very, very difficult situation. I want to ask that the clinician to explain about how to manage these people. Okay, sir?
Yeah. Sir, I have an answer to that. I think we are all responsible for information and misinformation, because there are people whom I have seen, and there are people who the common public also have seen. Even if it is falling below, even if it is around 50,000 or 60,000, they scare the patients and ask them to get the platelets and then transfuse them. Okay, the moment we are doing that, they must be thinking that people are not observing, number one. Number two, this message is not going to the others. Naturally, there will be a lot of information that transfers from one to the other. People would naturally become very skeptical about the doctor who is not transfusing even at 30,000 or 20,000 count of platelets. So maybe we are all responsible for that, because we don't educate properly, don't follow the guidelines, and at the same time we try to we do not try to tell them the logic. So this is the main problem. So I think public education is what is required at this moment of time, and if you have an odd patient of that nature, perhaps it's always better to send that patient to a higher center.
Most of the times in dengue, the cause of death.
Your voice is very low, Malleswara.
Sir, okay, sir. Right. Hello, sir. I am audible now, sir.
No, it's better.
Okay. Sir, in dengue, most of the times the cause of death is not because of thrombocytopenia, it is because of sepsis and shock, sir, usually. And septicemia and shock, that is the cause of death, not the thrombocytopenia and bleeding. Usually they die with ARDS and they die with shock, die with renal failure, not because of thrombocytopenia. But most of the times we stress on mostly platelets. But we have to monitor the general condition of the patient. The general condition of the patient is very good and is doing well, eating well and passing urine normally, and that patient is maintaining well. How to monitor platelets, but that is not so important. This is important. Blood pressure, general well-being, and urine output. These are the most important things.
Any comments on that, Srinivas?
Sir, we do the same thing here, sir. We are not bothered about this platelet count. We don't even panic also about this platelet count. So I ask my postgraduates not to go for a platelet transfusion very often. Usually we wanted the fluid actually, because it is said that the first 6 days, whatever we do, the leak will be there. We won't allow the patient to go into a state of hemorrhagic shock. That's what we are doing here. We don't panic. We usually go for the hypotension, that is SOFA score only, rather than the platelet count here.
Okay. Srinivas, here is another question from Nagaveni, Dr. Nagaveni. She says that if the CARD test is positive for Plasmodium vivax with no classical symptoms and no splenomegaly, do we still need to treat this with complete course of anti-malarials? That is a question.
This CARD test can be positive even after many days, sir. Even if the patient doesn't have malaria also, this CARD test will be positive. But if this patient is in a place where the QBC is available or a smear is available, we can confirm it, then we can go over the treatment. But in a remote area like an agency area, where people with malaria come, we have to treat them with chloroquine.
Yeah, no. She says that there are no symptoms.
No symptoms, we did not do it.
Yeah.
We did not do it.
So Nagaveni has to understand that if there are no symptoms, you don't need to treat. The simple CARD test will not confirm your diagnosis. Any other question? People can unmute and ask. Okay. So I don't see any questions in the chat box, nor anybody coming forward to ask questions. So if there are no further questions, I think we'll end this session here. And before ending, I thank all the three speakers very profusely, Professor Srinivas, Dr. Saujanya, and Professor Padmasri, for doing justice to their topics. And as I told you earlier, this particular program has been recorded and it will be uploaded in the YouTube. the YouTube address being Andhra Medical College, Visakhapatnam channel. You can always view that. Try to get clarifications for all your queries. Thank you very much. Thank you one and all for participating in this particular program.
Thank you, sir.
And